Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into some fascinating new reporting from New York Times journalists Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan in their work, Regime Change. We're going to unpack their central thesis, which is really intriguing. They argue that the White House doesn't just operate on raw political power, but is actually driven by a carefully constructed fantasy. Let's get right into how, according to them, perception literally becomes policy. For years, we've heard pundits compare this administration to a Game of Thrones-style power struggle, right? Just ruthless people battling it out for ultimate control with dragons and zombies. But Haberman and Swan say that comparison is completely off the mark. They argue the real driver here isn't some Machiavellian masterclass. It's actually make-believe. It's a world where the protagonists build their reality based on snippets of information they just wish were true. So let's look at the mechanics of this make-believe world, specifically how contradictory facts are simply ignored and erased. The authors point out a pretty stark contrast between claims and reality. For instance, take the assertion that America was at its absolute wealthiest back between 1870 and 1913 because it was a quote-unquote tariff country. Well, the authors fact-checked this, and reality paints a very different picture. Americans are actually 6 times richer today, and that's just looking at the raw financial numbers. It completely ignores the massive value of modern miracles we take for granted, like GPS and antibiotics. The book shares this wild anecdote about what happens when real data collides with this alternate reality. The Commerce Secretary apparently showed the president the actual relatively low tariff numbers for China and India. The response? The data was explicitly dismissed as, well, nonsense. An aide, Natalie Harp, whose job was reportedly to print out positive news, was immediately told to go Google the real numbers. But as the authors note, despite her best efforts, she couldn't pull up positive numbers that just didn't exist. Haberman and Swan detail another massive reality distortion, this time on the global stage. Internally, the administration was claiming the Philippines totally solved its drug problem because its leader, Rodrigo Duterte, was dealing with dealers without worrying about due process. It was hailed as a huge success story. But in reality, the authors point out the Philippines still faces a massive drug crisis, and Duterte is actually facing trial in The Hague for crimes against humanity. To keep actual facts like that from popping the fantasy bubble, you need what the authors describe as a highly specific reality filter. They report that even grounded figures in the administration, like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, actively stay quiet. They hide what they know just to avoid upsetting the narrative. On top of that, swearing total allegiance to the belief that the 2020 election was stolen is essentially a mandatory job requirement. The authors even bring up a case where a candidate was instantly disqualified just for praising former Vice President Mike Pence, simply because Pence wouldn't play along with that specific narrative. And what happens when inconvenient facts do manage to slip through? The book claims they just get erased. After the tragic murder of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, the required narrative was that America was under siege by left-wing extremists. The glaring problem was an official Department of Justice study showing that far-right terrorists actually kill many more people in America. So what was the solution? According to the book, the Justice Department simply memory-holed the entire study. But just erasing numbers is only half the battle. To build an alternate reality, you really have to control the language used to describe it. This brings us to redefining words. Take a look at this quote from advisor Stephen Miller. It perfectly captures how the administration weaponizes language. By branding a major political party as a domestic extremist organization, the authors argue this goes way beyond normal partisan attacks. They're fundamentally changing the definition of words to manufacture a completely new reality. According to the meticulous reporting in this explainer, dictionary definitions are just stretched to absolute absurdity. A terrorist isn't just someone using violence for ideological goals anymore. The label gets slapped on peaceful protesters or even completely non-existent groups. An emergency suddenly covers a trade deficit that America has literally managed since 1976. And an invasion? That's redefined to include foreigners crossing the border just to clean hotel rooms. Now, you might be wondering, why does this semantic shift actually matter? Well, the authors argue it leads directly to real-world consequences, where asserting the right to change definitions is asserting the right to change the law. The logical leap reported here is frankly terrifying in its simplicity. Step 1, the administration redefines a military conflict with Iran as non-a-war. Step 2, since it's magically no longer a war, they can entirely bypass Congress's permission to wage it. The book argues that redefining words isn't just empty rhetoric, it's a calculated tool to grab executive power and completely bulldoze over traditional checks and balances. We see this fantasy directly steering global policy, too. The authors describe this moment where Israel's prime minister presented a regime change plan for Iran. The CIA's intelligence assessment basically called the plan farcical. But the authors report that this expert intelligence was just tossed out the window. Why? Simply because the president had a good feeling about it. Global stability was being risked on pure intuition rather than hard data. And while this fantasy dictates policy, the book claims some very real-world financial leveraging is happening in the background. Gulf states that rely on American protection suddenly start pouring money into family crypto ventures. Threats of massive tariffs mysteriously disappear the moment foreign countries greenlight hotel and golf course projects. The reporting even dives into serious allegations against lawyer Boris Epshteyn. He's accused of demanding big payoffs from prospective appointees to secure their jobs and then badmouthing anyone who refuses, like current Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. When advised to cut ties with Epshteyn, the president reportedly flat out refused, because he values lawyers who, in his mind, will do absolutely anything for him. To wrap up this explainer, let's look at a really striking juxtaposition from the author's own one-hour interview with the president. Context is everything here. This interview took place on the 17th day of a highly tense military conflict with Iran. The global stakes were absolutely soaring, and Brent crude oil was spiking well over $100 a barrel. The whole world was on edge. Yet, right in the middle of this massive, globally destabilizing crisis, what was the focus inside the room? The authors note the administration was fixated on trivial vanities. The president was eagerly showing off blueprints for his new White House ballroom. Aides even recounted him personally supergluing fancy gold decorations onto an Oval Office fireplace. The authors really emphasized this wild disconnect between global peril and a bizarre focus on interior decorating. During that exact same interview, the president shared a quote from someone he called a historian. This person claimed the president was, quote, without question, the most powerful man that the planet has ever known. They even compared him favorably to Alexander the Great, the Caesars, Hitler, Mao, and Stalin. Basically just because he had airplanes and global reach. But here is the kicker. The authors reveal that this grand historian, the guy providing this massive ego-boosting historical framework, was actually a golf caddy. And that leaves us with one crucial, really chilling question to consider. When the information shaping a worldview is curated by sycophants instead of experts, what exactly happens when that fabricated reality inevitably crashes into actual global crises? Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.